English quite well, but not in public, not to us. An opera lover, she has got a fiercely analytical intelligence, strong views, and a dry wit. But none of that's on show. When you delve into her background and childhood, you begin to discover the extraordinary story behind the public image. In Britain, given how much she matters to us, we know ridiculously little about Angela Merkel. She's criticised for her style and tone, the humorless German Hausfrau who cooks potato soup and keeps her cards worryingly close to her chest. Or, more often, she's attacked as the new Iron Chancellor, determined to impose agonising fiscal discipline on weaker, more feckless economies and mould all Europe into a copy of Germany. A good place to start, I think, is to ditch the easy historical comparisons, because Angela Merkel is a figure of our here and now, and it's vital to understand her better. Why? Because she matters more to our future than, what, 95% of British politicians? And now, as she faces the German voters once more, with soaring popularity rates, more than ever we need to understand this woman. Angela Merkel is making modern Europe. What made Merkel? Angela Merkel is unlike any previous leader of Germany. In fact, she's different to pretty much any leading German politician. Not simply because she's a woman, it's because she grew up in former East Germany, one of the most paranoid states at the heart of the communist Eastern Bloc. Merkel was born Angela Kasner in Hamburg in West Germany. Her father, Horst, was a Lutheran pastor and her mother was a teacher. But in 1954, when Angela was just a few weeks old, her father uprooted his family from the West and moved them to East Germany. He brought them to Templin, a small town about 50 miles north of Berlin, to run a parish and train young priests in a seminary.
Templin was mainly an agricultural area. Back then there were several construction companies and a lot of farms. There was also a place called Waldhof, where disabled children lived.
The Waldhof was an estate on the outskirts of Templin, where Horst Kasner ran his seminary and a centre for the mentally disabled. It was in these surroundings, away from other families and children, that Angela Merkel lived until she was 18. An unusual home that may have helped forge a sense of differentness, of being an outsider. As a politician, Merkel has never been overbearing when it comes to her religious views. But it's clear that her father's position as a Lutheran pastor had a deep influence on her, creating a powerful moral compass. Merkel went to the local schools in Templin.
Well, time hasn't stood still, and that shows in this building. The ideas and images of that time and the futures we all imagined for ourselves back then come back all of a sudden. You can still precisely picture the rows of chairs right here, which haven't been here for a long time. She was very quiet, a rather plain and mousy girl, but very nice and friendly and extraordinarily intelligent.
Merkel's maths teacher remembers the young Angela being one of his most gifted pupils.
I don't recall an example where she ever gave up. Surely there were moments when she didn't get to a goal, but when it got difficult and she had a task in front of her which asked too much, she tried to calculate it in reverse.
Merkel is the first German chancellor born after the Second World War. Her childhood was shaped by the fear and paranoia of the Cold War. In 1945, Germany had been divided into two states, controlled separately by the Allies and the Soviet Union. The former capital, Berlin, was split into two zones, but people could still cross the city freely.
The wall has gone up right across the divided city. It has transformed what were busy crossing points into silent and deserted cul-de-sacs.
And then, on the 13th of August 1961, in the middle of the night, troops in East Germany put up fences all along the border, dividing Berlin. Within days, they began replacing the barbed wire with concrete blocks, and the Berlin Wall looked like a permanent structure. Back here in Templin, as across the rest of East Germany, the reaction was of utter shock. Angela Merkel later described the day the wall went up as her first political memory. Her father, the pastor, preached a sermon here in Templin, and she said afterwards everybody was in tears. The German people were divided, and those caught on the eastern side were locked in. Meanwhile, Berlin had become the front line of the battle between capitalism and communism. John F. Kennedy had come to town.
Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Growing up in a socialist dictatorship, whatever she truly believed about the system, Angela Merkel learnt how to keep her cards close to her chest. East Germans rarely discussed politics in public for fear of drawing attention from the Stasi, the secret police.
Presumably everyone felt this, and it led people to have a network of hidden lives. We all here had some kind of double identity.
Merkel's father, a towering figure, believed in the basic idea of socialism, but he disagreed with the way it was being implemented by the state. He held politically charged gatherings at his seminary, and as Angela grew up, vigorous debates rang around the dinner table. At school, Merkel excelled in both maths and Russian, even winning Templin's annual Russian Language Olympics.
She was really gifted in languages, and as she had already begun to learn Russian in the 5th class, she learned Russian there intensively too. And there was, just like in mathematics, a district Russian club, which specialized in promoting Russian, and she took part in that with magnificent success.
Children of the clergy were routinely discriminated against in East Germany, and so Angela's parents encouraged her to join the communist youth organization, the Free German Youth. This rare photograph shows Merkel after she won a silver Lessing medal given for excellent school results and also outstanding socialist engagement. Merkel has been criticized for being a member of the Free German Youth, but her parents felt it was the only way she could succeed and get a place at university. It also stopped people from questioning her political beliefs.
It's hard to become politically active under the wrong conditions, or if you disagree, or cannot identify with the given political system. Or else, what can you do? You can lapse into a sort of shock-induced paralysis, just hoping winter will pass and the flowers will begin to grow eventually, like many people did at the time.
Für mich hatte ich dann entschieden, du hast, wenn es zu bunt wird und zu schlimm wird, die Möglichkeit zu versuchen rauszukommen. Und ansonsten führst du ein Leben, wo du versuchst auch dich nicht letztlich an diesem System so aufzureiben, dass es mich kaputt macht. Auch davor hatte ich Angst.
For Merkel, there was no alternative, and she became on the surface a dutiful young communist. But underneath, she was still a normal teenage girl. Even in East Germany, there was fun to be had.
We always had to pass through the forest to the socialist production plant we were trained at, to see how production worked and what different careers looked like. One time, we even stole a case of beer from the smithy, drank it all, and then returned home rather merry. Obviously, Angela did not miss out on any of that either.
In 1973, Angela Merkel stepped out of the long shadow cast by her father and went to university in the East German city of Leipzig to study physics. 4 years later, aged 23, she got married to Ulrich Merkel, a fellow physics student she'd met during a Russian exchange trip. They had a one-room flat in Leipzig. After graduating, they moved to East Berlin, where Merkel started a PhD. Her doctorate was in quantum chemistry, a theoretical field in which she looked at the decay of hydrocarbon molecules. She finished her doctorate and then worked as a researcher at the Academy of Sciences in Adlershof, then the most important research institution in East Germany.
It was organized like a Soviet Academy of the Sciences. It was an independent research institution. There were thousands of scientists working here. She was doing her PhD here in this building, making research for that, with great expectations for a career as a scientist in East Germany.
One of those ambitious young scientists was Michael Schindhelm.
Angela was working there. She was the only female. I was 23, she was maybe 28 or so, 29. And a very, very open-minded and cheerful person. I could see that she really wants to become a kind of serious shot in the field of theoretical chemistry.
Studying quantum chemistry wasn't simply Angela Merkel's first passion. Science was a way of keeping out of the watchful eye of the East German regime.
Our department dealt with something which was not crucial for the victory of the communist world over the bad and evil capitalism. So that's why we had more leeway, I would say, also intellectually, ideologically, in comparison to many of our colleagues who were closer to the industry and had really to achieve results which could be translated into economical revenue or development at least.
The connection between science and politics isn't quite as obscure as it may seem. Angela Merkel said that she always wanted to use power. It's just that before the wall came down, she wanted power over molecules to change the world. And after the wall came down, it was power on a wider stage. And the comparison with the young Margaret Thatcher is hard to avoid, another scientist. But there's a very, very interesting distinction. From her early 20s to her mid-30s, Angela Merkel was completely unable to express her real views. It was far too dangerous, and it's from there, surely, that the woman who used to be known as the grey mouse got her habit of caution and discretion and never revealing too much about herself. In the early 1980s, Angela Merkel's marriage broke up, but she kept her husband's name. She moved out of their flat and into a squat in East Berlin, close to her friend Michael Schindhelm.
We lived at that time in East Berlin, in this kind of bohemian neighborhood of Prenzlauer Berg, and the Academy of Sciences were in the far south of the city. So we had to cross the city every morning by train. At several points we were looking actually not only at the wall dividing the two parts of the city, but even beyond. So you could always see the other part of the city, which was at the same time for us a no-go area. Our mind was sort of shaped by this kind of absurd of a social situation, being trapped, being locked in, trying to find channels to look out also.
But Merkel wouldn't be trapped for much longer. Across the Eastern Bloc, things were starting to change.
Mr. Gorbachev has moved rapidly through the Soviet hierarchy, but never more rapidly than today.
In March 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union and began his program of perestroika, a radical restructuring of his country's economy.
Some 30 world leaders were in Moscow, all wanted a mini-summit with Mr. Gorbachev.
The news of Gorbachev's reforms gripped East Germany. Merkel and her friends sensed that their moment was rapidly approaching. They were still discussing politics in private, but now these misgivings were simmering under the surface, ready to burst out into the open.
In many ways, we of course did not enjoy an urban life, and so we most of the time met friends at home. And there was always a little bit of almost conspiracy involved, in the sense that you would always know that a few people who show up may also be involved in certain political activities.
When you live in a dictatorship, it probably might be dangerous to talk about politics. But they were watching West German TV. They were listening to West German radio. So they were all informed about what's going on in the world.
Freedom leads to prosperity. Freedom replaces the ancient hatreds among nations with comity and peace. Freedom is the victor.
In 1987, Berlin became a platform for another US president.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
For now, the wall remained up. But meanwhile, small political movements were beginning to gain in strength and number. Very soon, these seismic changes would upend the quiet life of Angela Merkel.
The level of discontent in the society and among ourselves grew. And at the same time, you saw also that in the Soviet Union and other countries, the political situation crumbled and changed. That all encouraged to release this potential of criticism and to translate it into activities. Merkel did so too.
But Merkel's activities at this time were still confined to private discussions with other intellectuals. Then, in 1989, everything changed. On November the 9th, after months of simmering tension, events suddenly came to a head. The Communist Party spokesman misunderstood an order about travel restrictions and announced that East Germans were now allowed to travel directly to the West. Everyone rushed to the Berlin Wall, sensing something amazing was about to happen. Everyone, that is, apart from Angela Merkel. And so the Berlin Wall comes down, pivotal moment in the story of the European peoples. And Angela Merkel? Well, it's a Thursday night, so Angela Merkel does what she always does on a Thursday night. She goes for a sauna with her friend, wearing even less than me. And then after the sauna, they go for a beer. This is a story about Germans. Merkel's decision to stick to her routine was in stark contrast to the way most young people in Berlin reacted.
We got in the car and started driving. At that time, many drove with excessive speed towards Bornholmer Straße, the border crossing, and this was supposed to already be open. You could see many people. I parked my car and I was then pushed in this huge crowd. And then I remembered, oh dear, I've forgotten my ID card. My blue ID card that I'd left lying in the car. Are they going to let me back in?
Many queued eagerly to get an official stamp on their papers to prove that they'd been there on the night the Berlin Wall crumbled.
As the steam was rising in Angela Merkel's sauna, the mist of communism was also lifting from the East German people. The Berlin Wall was tumbling down, and things were changing for everyone, even for Angela.
Well, all of a sudden, lots of things were possible that were previously impossible. You could suddenly travel, you could compete for all positions in society. So you could establish political parties. You could even get yourself elected as a board member of a party, or maybe even as a chairman, or become a minister.
It was really something like a whirlpool for all of us. Merkel, like myself too, we come from a generation, we were around 30, where it was not too late to reinvent yourself. Some people did this, like for example Angela Merkel. And she saw that politics become something extremely important in general, because it was obvious that the two Germanys have to reunify and to create a completely new country.
Merkel wanted to join a political party. She chose Democratic Awakening, a group of centre-right activists.
One day, Frau Merkel knocked at the door of the office of Democratic Awakening, which we had founded, and asked if she could be part of this as well.
Als ich dorthin kam, waren eingepackte, also eingeschweißte Computer dort, die als Geschenke oder Gaben aus der Bundesrepublik alt gekommen waren. Und ich hatte den Eindruck, dass ich dort bei der Installation ein bisschen helfen konnte, weil das meinem Arbeitsgebiet entsprach. Ich glaube, sehr viel habe ich dann aber auch nicht gemacht, außer die Plastikfolien da abgerissen. Aber auf jeden Fall war das so ein Ansatzpunkt, ein praktischer Ansatzpunkt.
The period immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall produced a maelstrom in German politics. Cafe conversations became street protests. Movements became political parties. Individuals tried to take control of their country for the first time. Angela Merkel is 35. She has always been a loyal member of East German society. In films like this, people like me pretend that we understand every aspect of the story. But I have to say to you, this is one of the most obscure and mysterious parts of the Angela Merkel story. What was going on in her head in that remarkably short period of time when she went from being an obscure East German citizen to being a leading German politician? We really don't know. But whatever she was thinking, it wasn't long before Merkel became a spokesperson for Democratic Awakening. Soon the fledgling activists found themselves merging with more established political parties, campaigning for a reunited Germany. Lothar de Maizière was a lawyer and a former professional viola player who now led this centre-right coalition for the East German elections in 1990. He took on Matthias Gehler as his spokesman, but he needed another voice to help deliver his message to the voters. And Merkel happened to be the right person in the right place at the right time.
He asked me, why don't we take someone from our own ranks? And I was asked, who could that be? But I couldn't think of anyone. We were discussing the matter together with Lothar de Maizière, and his advisor remembered that we had a meal with the woman from Democratic Awakening.
De Maizière made Angela Merkel his deputy spokeswoman for the newly named Alliance for Germany.
She then became engaged in campaigning, which was a new experience to all of us. many of us struck quite a few hard blows without realizing that we still had to be able to sit down for coalition talks afterwards. She played a very moderating and balanced role in that phase, always trying to appease all parties.
I was her boss, and up to this point, Frau Merkel had always acted very much in the background. And you had to tell her from time to time, Angela, you'll have to speak at the podium too. And then she did.
Ja, meine Damen und Herren, heute gab es eine Ministerratssitzung mit der wohl maximalen Tagesordnung, die es je gab. Es waren über 30 Punkte. Und ich werde mich bemühen, in aller Kürze, aber auch in der gebotenen Ausführlichkeit, Sie zu informieren.
Angela Merkel stood out from the rest. She seemed very different to the traditional slick and polished image of a politician.
She didn't seem to care about her outward appearance at all. She was a typical GDR scientist in that respect, wearing a baggy skirt and Jesus sandals and a cropped haircut. I remember coming back from our first trip and remarking to my female office manager, couldn't you go out shopping for clothes with her?
In March 1990, the Alliance won the general election in East Germany, and Lothar de Maizière became Prime Minister. Now both halves of Germany were racing towards reunification. Many politicians, particularly in France, felt threatened by the idea of a larger, more powerful Germany. And so to constrain the new Germany, to tie it down politically and economically, they struck a deal. Germany was allowed to reunify, but in return they signed the Treaty of Maastricht, which created the European Union and the promise of a single currency. This continent-changing event, the creation of a united Germany inside a united Europe, would become the driving force of Merkel's political vision, and it happened at a critical time in her career. In this new world of unified German politics, Merkel was moving into a much bigger league. She joined the largest party in West Germany, the overwhelmingly male and patriarchal Christian Democrats, or CDU. An East German woman reared by communism joining conservatives startled many, but this time Merkel's real political vision was crystallizing.
Diese Erfahrung eines Neubeginns, also jedem Anfang wohnt ein Zauber inne, das wird vielleicht so etwas Schönes wird man nie wieder erleben. Bitte schön.
The CDU was led by Germany's Chancellor Helmut Kohl, the driving force behind reunification. Kohl had just won the election and now set about forming his cabinet. He wanted someone quiet, female, and a former East German.
And then I went from the Chancellor's office to the palace in Bonn, where I met Angela Merkel in the park and told her, "You're about to receive a call from Kohl to appoint you as minister." She was quite surprised. So she became Minister of Women's Issues, Youth and Sports.
Kohl called her his Mädchen, or little girl, and later promoted her to become Minister of the Environment, overseeing nature conservation and nuclear safety, hugely controversial issues in Germany. Merkel's tone was very different to the traditional Teutonic way of doing politics.
I've seen many situations at the very beginning where men tried to humiliate her. They were very authoritarian towards her. They just sat up strong and with a deep voice, and they were loud, and they were very decisive. And I realized that she let them have their way, but she was very soft, answering in a low voice. This was a behavior where men at the very beginning couldn't cope with at all, because that was not the typical behavior.
Merkel tolerated the prejudice and began to develop her own political persona. Herlinda Köhlbuhl has been photographing Merkel as part of a study of politicians as they rise in power and has watched her change.
I met her first in 1991 for my project Traces of Power. And first meeting I still remember because I photographed her then. She was shy, maybe a little bit awkward. She was never vain. And that's unusual in politics.
After she'd spent a few years photographing her, Köhlbuhl noticed that Merkel was gradually turning into a stateswoman.
That was 92, that was 95. Very shy still here, and suddenly it changed, and she was self-confident.
In the 1998 German elections, Helmut Kohl, by now somewhat bloated in power, lost to Gerhard Schröder's Social Democrats. Merkel's party, the CDU, went into opposition. A year later, it emerged that former Chancellor Kohl had been receiving donations into a secret slush fund which he'd used to reward his friends. He refused to identify the donor, claiming to have given his word of honour that he would remain anonymous. The German public had a new slogan, "Fatty's got to go," but many in the party were desperate to cover up the scandal. Angela Merkel, however, wanted to go public, and what she did next was like a scene from one of her favourite operas. In went the knife. For years, no one had dared to confront Helmut Kohl, the meaty colossus of politics, the man Margaret Thatcher described as simply so German. But once again, it was Angela Merkel at the moment of crisis who refused to follow the pack. Margaret Thatcher had gained power by taking on and defeating Edward Heath, the man who'd brought her into the cabinet, and now Angela Merkel, the Mädchen, the little girl, did exactly the same to Helmut Kohl. While Kohl was hiding behind his honour and the CDU was trying to gloss over the scandal, Angela Merkel wrote a front-page piece in a leading conservative newspaper denouncing Kohl and calling upon him to resign. It was an audacious act of patricide. Modern German politics had seen nothing like it before.
I was convinced that this letter was very well placed strategically, and that she did it with the right instinct and at the right moment. It was a turning point in her career.
It would be some time before Angela Merkel got the top job, but her public denunciation had made its mark. She quickly became the first female chair of the party. And again, there seemed to be uncanny echoes of Margaret Thatcher's story. A scientist from the provinces who overthrows a failed national leader and grabs the wheel of a heavily male party, taking it off who knows where. And the Thatcher comparisons aren't glib, because like Margaret Thatcher in her prime, Angela Merkel is a mistress of detail. She devours briefing documents. She loves facts. Politics is full of sprinters, and in Merkel, as with Thatcher, we have a very rare long-distance runner. But we have no chance of understanding this story if we don't realise that the differences between our politics and German politics are much more important than the similarities. Our politics is all about confrontation, violent argument, vivid, strong language and clear decisions, clash. German politics is a bit greyer. It's about patient bridge building between alliances and compromise. Angela Merkel is unideological. And so far as we can tell, she's completely uninterested in her own story, projecting her own image. She loves the opera, but she's never the diva on stage. Now that she was chair of the CDU, Merkel already had her eye on becoming Chancellor of Germany. But she'd chosen to play a long game, almost as long as one of those interminable Wagner operas she loves so much. So she surprised many by stepping aside, allowing another CDU candidate to challenge for the top job, knowing that in time her chance would come.
She knew I'm young, I wait 2 more years, he'll fail, and then I'll step in. You might call it Machiavellian. You might also say she's just prudent. Maybe that is the feminine side of her as well. It certainly was cunning, and she used this again and again. At a garden party at my house one afternoon, I introduced her to my friends. May I introduce you to the first women chancellor Germany will know? She was not happy about this remark. It was as if I was calling her game.
But Angela Merkel's game paid off. The CDU lost to Gerhard Schröder again in the 2002 election. And shortly afterwards, Merkel took over as leader of the Conservative opposition. By now, all around Europe, people were starting to take notice of Angela Merkel. Who was this woman? People were desperate to find out more. Jonathan Powell was Tony Blair's first chief of staff and accompanied him on a trip to meet Merkel in the run-up to her battle against Gerhard Schröder.
Tony Blair went to meet her. Well, she's still leader of the opposition, and we went to Berlin. And she was extraordinarily frank. She sort of sat down and said, 6 points: I have no charisma, I don't know how to communicate, etc., etc. All these sort of very frank comments to make to a politician, particularly one from another party. But Tony really got on with her straight away. She's very, very direct, very open, very plain-speaking, but also very political. One of the things people don't always understand about her is she's very partisan and actually a ruthless political operator. The way she dealt with Helmut Kohl, the way she dealt with all of her rivals in the CDU, was extraordinarily Machiavellian from that point of view. She would get rid of them in a switch of an eyebrow.
So the 2005 election approached, and Merkel began the campaign with a reluctant makeover, supported by a rather incongruous track by the Rolling Stones. It's hard to think of anyone less like a Rolling Stones girl than Angela Merkel. Now she was pitted against Gerhard Schröder, the glossy epitome of arrogant male bravado, with gleaming teeth, shiny hair, big fat cigars. But Schröder's office had been afraid of Merkel for several years and had asked a shrewd advisor to explain her mysterious rise.
I went to a restaurant, Borchhaus, and she was sitting at the table of the friends. And they invited me to come, and first Frau Merkel was quite friendly. And then I was presented to her as the head of the policy unit of the German Chancellor, and she froze. I couldn't tell her that I had written a favorable report about her and written to Schröder how dangerous she might one day be. But it was typical Merkel. She built a fence around her, and she stayed in the fence.
In September 2005, the battle for the Bundestag was nearing the finishing line. The result was incredibly close. Merkel had won, but only by a single percentage point, not enough to govern alone. The next stage was a live TV debate to decide which parties would form the coalition government and who would be the leader. And Schröder went on the attack.
Verglichen mit dem, was in dieser Republik geschrieben und gesendet worden ist, gibt es einen eindeutigen Verlierer. Und das ist nun wirklich Frau Merkel. Und das sollten auch Sie mal zur Kenntnis nehmen.
And Schröder, some people said he was drunk. He was blown up. He was really full of testosterone. And he was, you will never become chancellor, and so on. He was talking to her. And she was saying there, he was saying nothing.
Angela Merkel simply didn't rise to Gerhard Schröder's aggression. That night she showed that politics could have a different tone. You didn't have to be a flaming ideologue hectoring your opponent. She sat back and let Schröder implode on his own. A week after the 2005 vote, the CDU and Social Democrats agreed to form a grand coalition, where the two parties would be working together, and Angela Merkel became Chancellor of Germany. In her first address to the nation, she reminded the German people where she'd come from.
For me, she says, when the wall came down, it gave me enormous opportunities. I want to repay my country and give everybody a fresh start.
Angela Merkel, the girl who'd grown up in a divided post-war Germany, the young scientist who'd experienced the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism, and the fledgling politician who'd worked towards reunification, was now the most powerful woman in the world, leading Germany through the expansion of a united Europe.
We never had a queen in our German monarchy throughout the centuries, so it was really a major revolution when all of a sudden she became a chancellor. Being a woman in the world of politics will change everything, because the rest of the politicians could not continue to play their games as they had before.
Germany's new chancellor was offering a different style of leadership, and Germans had to adjust to a very different hand of authority.
She's somebody who's very much taken back. She's not pompous at all. She's very quiet, and I think that's what people like about her. She has a high standing in Germany because she's one of us.
Her big thing is indeed her little telephone. And I'm getting cell phone messages from her even now, sometimes, you know, late at evening or so, which she types into her little Nokia, not even, you know, a very sophisticated machine. But that shows that she believes in very direct contact with a few people.
Merkel is said to do her own shopping and likes gardening and making cakes at home. She refused the Chancellor's grand penthouse apartment and instead lives in an ordinary flat with her second husband, a chemistry professor who consistently avoids the media. In personal terms, Angela Merkel's remained humble and true to her roots, but she has a very distinctive and modern German political outlook. She's pro-market, pro-freedom, pro-capitalism, but she's also in favour of trade unions, seeing business and workers as equal partners, a big difference to conservative traditions here in Britain.
She never ever polarizes. She always makes sure that people save their face. And I think that's one of the reasons why she's successful to go forward with tricky questions, because she knows you always see people twice during your life. And therefore she really tries to keep people in a consensus. This is sometimes slow, it takes time.
Das wird mir häufig zum Beispiel auch vorgeworfen. Ich würde nicht aus dem Pushen kommen, ich würde nicht handeln, ich würde die Dinge treiben lassen. Für mich ist immer wichtig, dass ich mir alle möglichen Entscheidungsoptionen, wie man es machen könnte, durchspiele. Und zwar nicht nur wie so ein theoretisches Experiment, also einmal im Kopf, sondern auch versuche, damit zu leben. Also einen Tag lang, wie entwickelt sich das und was würde das bedeuten? Wer würde was dazu sagen? Wer würde vielleicht was darüber schreiben? Wer würde das kritisieren?
When it comes to politics, Germany, a little bit like the EU itself, is a geometric system of different circles of power which have to be aligned and reconciled in order for the centre to act, an endless balancing game. And Angela Merkel's step-by-step approach seems well suited to bringing all these elements together. In Germany, politics follows along behind manufacturing and industry, and it's these institutions that have created the economic giant the country has become. All that boring-sounding consensus and deliberation have underpinned a steady, long-term focus on growth and economic success.
The one advantage German political system has over ours is long-term political planning and long-term economic planning. They're able to make plans for the future in a way that we're not quite so able to do. So German politics can produce that consensus where you stay on a trajectory for a long time, whereas we tend to veer from side to side. And that does give you an advantage.
What Germany doesn't have is the UK's vibrant and rigorous parliamentary democracy system, that can be much more reactive and decisive. But Germany's political system is more effective at bringing people together to agree on difficult decisions, and this is one of Merkel's strengths. She may be the queen of consensus, but Angela Merkel has plenty of critics, both at home and abroad. In Germany, some very hostile biographies have been published, including this one, which portrays her as the godmother, a mafia boss constantly scheming to stay in power. Around Europe, there are the lazy caricatures of the jackbooted German, and even suggestions that Angela Merkel is not quite human. In Berlin itself, she is seen as the mysterious East German, someone who can't be, can she, quite as straightforward and blunt as she seems. Despite the criticism, both home and abroad, Merkel's popularity as Chancellor has remained high. She was re-elected in September 2009 with an even larger share of the vote. But she was about to face some of the biggest challenges of her career.
A nuclear emergency has been declared after a number of reactors automatically shut down following the quake. Fires have broken out in several places, including an oil refinery.
The Fukushima nuclear plant melted down in Japan, and Merkel's strongly pro-nuclear approach came under attack from Germany's very influential Green movement. Merkel spent an entire European summit meeting silently devouring documents on nuclear safety and demanding ever more updates from Berlin, absorbing all the information before suddenly making a shock announcement.
Unser Energiesystem grundlegend verändert werden muss, aber auch grundlegend verändert werden kann. Wir wollen, dass der Strom der
She announced that all of Germany's nuclear plants would be closed. It was an extraordinary U-turn for a former scientist who'd previously been a vigorous supporter of Germany's nuclear industry. And it showed that she was able to change course dramatically without seemingly affecting her popularity. But there would be another, far greater test ahead in this, her second chancellorship.
The Greeks are warned that they could drown in debt unless drastic spending cuts are agreed.
The Eurozone financial crisis has been the most dramatic challenge for post-war Europe. It all started when Greece revealed an enormous public deficit, but it soon emerged that other countries were in similar dire straits. And who had the money? Germany had the money.
Mrs. Merkel has set out some pretty clear red lines in the last 2 or 3 years, but then she's shown a willingness to cross them when necessary. Some people argue that she's been a prisoner of German public opinion all the way through the Euro crisis. I don't think that's quite right. I actually think she believes what she says about deficit reduction and structural reform being the answer.
Und dass die Wirtschaft der Politik und den Menschen zu dienen hat und nicht umgekehrt.
The whole of Europe was waiting to see if Germany would bail out the struggling members of the Eurozone. But Angela Merkel seemed to be dithering. Why?
I see in the Euro crisis Mrs. Merkel's two fathers, if you like, battling it out. One is her real father, the East German Protestant clergyman who taught her that economics was really a moral crusade, that you shouldn't get into debt, and if you do, you've got to get out of it. That's been on one side a very strong view. On the other side, her political father, Helmut Kohl, who believed above all that there could never be a unified Germany at peace with itself unless there was a unified Europe. And so the commitment to Europe is absolute. And at various points in the Euro crisis, those two political fathers have been fighting it out.
To start with, it seems as though her first father, the Lutheran pastor, had won and that other Eurozone countries would just have to get themselves out of debt. But what about European unity? Caution and hesitation have always been hallmarks of the Merkel machine. Many were exasperated now about how slowly the German tortoise was moving. And the tortoise never wins the race, right?
You cannot deal a euro crisis by being very authoritarian. You only can manage such a crisis if you take a lot of people along the way. Angela Merkel always knew where she wanted to end up, but she took time to find a way where everybody could go along with.
Merkel knew that if Germany was to sanction a Greek bailout, she had to sell the rescue plan to her own hard-working, tax-paying people.
She had to move German public opinion in gradual steps. She could not move them to paying for the Greeks, to paying for the Spaniards, to paying for the Portuguese in one go. She had to take them to the edge of a cliff each time, show them what the choice was if they didn't agree to do the subsidies, and then persuade them. So I think she actually played it extremely cleverly.
Finally, Merkel presented her plan to Europe. The Greek economy would be bailed out, carrot, but the Greeks would have to accept brutal fiscal conditions, stick.
Es ist natürlich von allergrößter Wichtigkeit, dass die Programme, die wir mit Griechenland vereinbart haben, auch weiter fortgeführt werden, dass der Weg, den Griechenland eingeschlagen hat.
The same would follow for other struggling Eurozone economies. Merkel had suddenly been thrown into the position of becoming Europe's de facto leader. Reluctantly, taking a role she'd never asked for and didn't expect. Imposing austerity measures, massive cuts in public sector salaries, jobs, extending the age of retirement. Did the Berlin Wall fall for this? In Athens, the austerity plans sparked strikes and riots, and Merkel became a figure of hate. Some people accused Germany of trying to take over Europe.
Haftung und Kontrolle zusammengehören müssen. Das heißt, wer ist sozusagen für mich und damit für den Steuerzahler in Deutschland?
And probably nothing has done more damage to Angela Merkel's reputation than this image of her sitting smugly in Berlin at the favourite table of her favourite restaurant, which is, by the way, a Greek restaurant, imposing mass unemployment and terrifying austerity on the weaker economies of southern Europe. But several things have to be said on the other side. First of all, given Germans' historic terror of inflation and their recent economic success, an economy that's been well run and strong, virtually any German leader would have had to say more or less what Angela Merkel has said. Second, she has always maintained that the collapse of the euro would be followed by the collapse of the entire European project, something which terrifies Germans and many others in Europe.
If the euro fails, Europe fails. The blunt warning from the German Chancellor.
Der Euro ist der Garant eines einigen Europas. Oder anders gesagt, scheitert der Euro, scheitert Europa. Und weil ein Europa
No one should doubt Angela Merkel's total commitment to maintain the European Union. The fall of the Berlin Wall meant freedom, and for her was a European victory. And so she accords today's European project very special significance. To Angela Merkel, unlike to many British people, Europe means freedom. On the future of the EU, at least, she does not compromise.
Well, I think there's been a lot of misplaced criticism in Britain about Merkel's approach to the euro crisis. I think she was very clear from the start. She sent very clear signals. She talked about if the euro collapses, the European Union collapses. She was absolutely clear she was drawing a line and not going to allow the euro to collapse, and she had the advantage of political consensus in the country.
Today, the euro is still in crisis, but frankly, it hasn't yet failed. She may be working within strict limitations, but Angela Merkel is determined to support the EU, and she's shown that she can be flexible. Like Tony Blair before him, David Cameron has found Merkel to be friendly and reasonable in his private conversations, which are conducted in English. Now Europe is plunging into a new phase. Britain wants renegotiation of the EU treaty, the framework that binds the countries together. Earlier this year, David Cameron proposed an in-out referendum on the UK's future inside the EU, and to win he needs a German deal. Fortunately for the British Prime Minister, Angela Merkel's response was in many ways extraordinary. A Kerl or a Schroeder would have angrily brushed him aside, But Merkel played an entirely different hand. She extended him a personal invitation to come and stay at her official guest residence outside Berlin. It's become a warm relationship. Downing Street refused to reveal the details of what they discussed, but said that the two leaders had agreed to work together to make the EU more competitive and flexible. Angela Merkel has mattered much more to us and to the full European story than perhaps we have realised. Is she going to remain as crucial in the future? Well, probably. The results from the imminent German elections can't be guaranteed, but if Merkel is successful, as many predict, she will have another chance to secure her legacy.
At the very beginning, there was a lot of mistrust that a woman really can't be standing up for being a chancellor. The good part is that today, young girls in Germany, for example, if you ask them, do you want to be chancellor one day? They might answer, why not? Because they have this good example.
I think she is a unified German. It's only a few who are this. They're not at home in the West, and they're no longer at home in the East. And she helped to bring the country together, to show that Eastern Germans could do something, that they are very good in internationally.
She is enjoying power now, which was a category that probably 10, 15 years ago didn't even exist for her. And now, in a sense, she is power incarnate. And in all the decisions, one has the feeling that the conservation of power might be more important than the righteousness of the decision herself.
I think a lot of European leaders have come and gone while Mrs. Merkel has been in charge. She's outlasted pretty much everyone, each one of us. And so I think there's a certain respect that comes from being one of the longest serving people around the table. New generations of leaders have to deal with her and recognise that she carries some real weight and authority.
What does that authority mean? Like many British politicians, Angela Merkel emphasises the values of hard work, paying your taxes, doing the right thing. But she's also very different. Merkel's vision is rooted in the European Union. If anything threatens to destroy or weaken the EU, then she's against it. Crucially, however, she's also broadly pro-British and more pragmatic. She's a better listener than any previous German chancellor. Whatever happens in these elections, Angela Merkel is an unlikely political colossus. For our part of the world, in our times, she's probably the pivotal figure. But as we in Britain begin to debate a different relationship with Europe and turn to Berlin for understanding and compromise, we may come to regard Angela Merkel not as a forbidding German Hausfrau, but